In this lecture, you will learn about the California Gold Rush, mining camps, the Chinese in California, and California Native Americans. In January 1848, James Marshall discovered gold in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada. Between 1849 and 1852, more than 250,000 descended on California, hoping to strike it rich in the California Gold Rush, one of the wildest mining stampedes in world history. As a consequence, towns and cities grew rapidly throughout the West, notably San Francisco, whose population grew from about 500 in 1848 to almost 50,000 by 1853. The Gold Rush was a global event, and 25% of those who came to California during the Gold Rush were foreign-born. Some of them came from Mexico, others from Peru, Chile, and China. Ironically, the ones who will strike it rich in California will not be the individual miners. The ones who really benefited from the gold rush were the merchants and entrepreneurs that helped popularize the gold rush. For example, Samuel Barnard sold shovels and made himself rich. Significantly, the gold rush spawned another industry, publication of alleged guidebooks devices for gold mining. As the population grew, mining towns began to emerge all over California. At the same time all this growth occurred, Mexico and the United States had just signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and initially there was no U.S. territorial government in California. To create some type of order, each mining town created its own mining codes. To create mining codes, typically each camp had a mass meeting to organize a mining district and elect a committee to draw up a set of regulations. Eventually, more than 500 camps adopted such codes. They were influenced by Spanish-Mexican mining codes and customs that defined the permissible size of a claim and required that it be continuously worked if it was to remain valid. The miners were not given a title to ownership, just permission to use the land. And each district elected a chairman to keep order and arbitrate disputes. Each person could have one claim, and the size was typically about 100 to 150 feet. Where gold deposits were rich, an individual might be permitted to claim just 10 square feet. However, since there were no jail, punishment for breaking the laws, such as fines or banishment, often degenerated into lawless mobs. The ethnic patchwork of this. Moreover, mining codes were also used by white American miners to map ideas about race. The ethnic patchwork of these frontier towns belied a clearly defined socioeconomic arrangement that saw whites on top as landowners and managers, with poor whites and ethnic minorities working the mines and assorted jobs. The miners rarely had much money or mining experience, and for many of them, life in the goldfields was nasty, brutish, and often short. Thus, the competition for land, resources, and riches further individual and collective abuses, particularly against Indians, older Mexican communities, and the Chinese. Restricted covenants that barred Mexicans, Asiatic, and other foreigners from mining began to spread throughout the state. Also, problems emerged from vigilante criminal justice committees, and mob hangings and lynchings became all too common. Bigotry and efforts to establish civic order brought intense scrutiny into many immigrants, particularly the Chinese immigrants, often making them victims of racial violence. Many of the first Chinese and the Americans came in the 1830s and 1840s to parts of Latin America and the Caribbean, where labor systems were built by the Spanish. In the mid-19th century, China was in transition from a major world power to a semi-colonized nation. The Opium Wars of 1839 and 1856 reversed the flow of silver out of China, and it devastated the cash economy. The Taiping Rebellion from 1853 to 1864 led to the death of millions, and it left much of southern China in control of warlords. From 1848 to 1882, 335,000 Chinese immigrated to California. In 1865, around 10,000 were hired to build a railroad. After 1870, Chinese increasingly moved to cities like San Francisco, Stockton, and Sacramento. Understandably, many of these Chinese immigrants sought the company of his countrymen, and very quickly, small Chinese settlements emerged in the mine towns and cities. The largest and most important of these communities was in San Francisco, in what will become Chinatown. The Chinese were instrumental in building California's infrastructure. As mentioned earlier, they were initially employed in the Transcontinental Railroad. Their labor was often sought by employers who described them as hardworking and docile. But as an economic depression hit in the 1870s, we see the attitude towards the Chinese change. San Francisco started to fill up with unemployed and restless men. This, compiled with the release of 12,000 Chinese workers after the completion of the railroad, caused racial tensions to mount. White workers then began to blame the economic and political problems on the Chinese. The Yellow Peril, as it was described, was a fear that the Chinese were a danger to the West and that enormous numbers of Chinese immigrants will inundate the state if allowed. This fear would soon lead to the vilification of the Chinese as a group that was taking jobs away from Americans, as criminals, rapists, and murderers. The Chinese then began to be segregated residentially and occupationally, and they were made ineligible for citizenship. Moreover, along with blacks and Indians, the Chinese were denied public education and the right to testify in court. As early as 1852, people began to demand a halt to Chinese immigration. Then violence ensued, with hundreds of incidents of violence against Chinese immigrants and torching of Chinese residencies. Even whole Chinatowns were burned to the ground. Residential mandates were also created, in which it made it illegal to sleep in a room with less than 500 feet of air per person. This targeted overpopulated Chinatowns. They also targeted grooming. For example, once in jail, the state initiated a measure requiring haircut to the scalp, which inflicted extreme indignity to many Chinese. Some laws also targeted the consumption of foreign foods, religions, and customs. These laws then fed into the creation of the Chinese Exclusion Act. In the spring of 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed by Congress and signed by President Shasta A. Arthur. This act provided an absolute 10-year moratorium on Chinese labor immigration. For the first time, federal law prescribed entry of an ethnic group on the premise that it endangered the good order of certain localities. Under this act, the Chinese are the only national group to be singled out by name for a denial of admission to the country. The Chinese Exclusion Act will serve as a blueprint for American immigration policy to come. It was also the beginning of the term illegal alien, and once the U.S. established itself as gatekeeper nation, discourse, the words people use, the images people invoke, would then transfer from one excludable group to another. As the gold rush attracted more and more people, prospectors asserted their dominance over other groups, especially Native Americans and the Californios, Spanish and Mexican settlers who had lived in California for decades. And the U.S. government was quick to implement a domestication policy. That included a set of laws, military violence, and eventually a reservation system. As a consequence of these policies, we will see a decline of about 80% of California's Native American population. The California Native population that numbered around 300,000 in 1848 will decline to around 25,000 in 1854 as a result of starvation, disease, a declining birth rate, and wholesale murder. When it pertained to laws, the California Constitutional Convention took away Native Americans' right to vote but inserted the word white in the appropriate sentence of the state's constitution. Furthermore, Indians were forbidden to hold office, own any property, drink alcohol, carry a gun, attend public schools, serve on juries, testify in court on their own or anyone else's behalf, or intermarry with non-Indians. Moreover, on the statement of any white, an Indian could be declared a vagrant and bound over to a white landowner or businessman to work. The Act for the Government and Protection of Indians will further subjugate Native Americans in California by legalizing the peonage system of the Mexican period, as well as establishing a system of indentureship of Indian children to any white citizen. That is, it legalized slavery in what was supposed to be a slave-free state. The act also stated that in no case shall a white man be convicted of any offense upon the testimony of an Indian. It also gave jurisdiction of most matters pertaining to Indians to local justices of the peace. It allowed, on the word of any white, for Indians to be declared vagrants, thrown in jail, and his or her labor sold. According to the act, Indian children could be apprenticed to a white citizen, provided the formal permission of the parents was obtained. If the parents were dead, then a local justice of the peace had the authority to assign an orphan for indentureship until the child reached the age of 25. However, through the convenience of cooperative justices, the act was easily distorted, and by the 1860s, the kidnapping and sale of Indian children was commonplace. The law also outlined specific crimes such as burning the prairie, buying alcohol, or stealing livestock, punishable by up to 25 lashes. The law was well received by those who took advantage of the free labor system. This primary source reads, "This law works beautifully. A few days ago, V.E. Ganger, formerly Indian agent, had some 80 Indians apprenticed to him and proposes to emigrate to Washoe with them as soon as he can cross the mountains. We hear of many others who are having them bound in numbers to suit. What a pity the provisions of this law are not extended to Greasers, Kenyans, and Asiatics." Aside from creating laws, the state and federal government also began to sponsor military action against Native Americans in California. Beginning with statehood, state governors authorized locals to organize militias to attack Indians. These hunting parties pushed California Indians further into mountain fortresses and thus limited options for food. Such wanton killings were subsidized by both the state and federal governments. Almost anyone could raise a volunteer company outfitted with guns, ammunition, horses, and supplies, and be assured that the government will reimburse all costs. In 1851 and 1852, the California legislature passed several acts authorizing payments of over $1.1 million to reimburse citizens for private military forays. And again in 1857, the state authorized an additional $410,000 for the same purposes. And the U.S. Congress reimbursed the state for what was nothing less than subsidized murder and genocide. Some of the most brutal massacres include the 1853 To'ola Village Massacre and the Clear Lake Massacre, in which 400 Pomo Indians were killed, mostly women and children. In 1853, in Northern California, a group of citizens from Crescent City formed a company and dressed like U.S. soldiers. They surrounded the Tolowa village of Jantoket, where at the center of the religious and political world of the Tolowa people, some 450 Tolowa gathered to pray to a universal spirit of beauty and order, and to thank God for life. Suddenly, they were attacked. A Tolowa man tells the story years later. The whites attacked, and the bullets were everywhere. Over 450 of our people were murdered or lay dying on the ground. Then the white men built a huge fire and threw in our sacred ceremonial dresses, the regalia, and our feathers, and the flames grew higher. Then they threw in the babies. Many of them were still alive. Some tied weights around the necks of the dead and threw them into the nearby water. 2 men escaped. They had been in the sacred Siwa house and crept down to the water's edge and hid under the lily pads, breathing through the reeds. The next morning, they found the water red with blood of their people. Then, as land became more and more scarce, the Office of Indian Affairs crafted a series of treaties with unauthorized chiefs, which reserved 7.5 million acres for reservations within the state. The Senate unanimously rejected the idea of the 7 million acres. Instead, they organized several reservations and farms in California, like the Tejon Reservation and Fresno Indian Farm. These places were grossly underfunded and subject to corruption, and by 1869, only 3 remain. Then in 1853, the Indian Appropriation Act was passed. The act authorized 5 military reservations to be made from public domain lands, the total lands not to exceed 25,000 acres. The land will not belong to the Indians, but will be owned by the federal government. And despite the federal government's declaration that residence will be optional in the reservations, the U.S. military assisted by creating volunteer companies of citizens that began rounding up the Indians and keeping them on the reservations against their wills. Finally, in the 1870s, we will have the established reservation system. The federal government, through a series of executive orders, began to establish the reservation system. Between 1875 and 1877, also through executive orders, the federal government established 13 separate reservations in Southern California for the so-called Mission Indians. Over the next 3 decades, these Southern California reservations had their sizes adjusted. Sometimes parts were returned to the public domain, sometimes a few acres were added. But, as anthropologist Alfred Kroeber noted, the reservations were founded on the principle not of attempting to do something for the native, but of getting him out of the white man's way as cheaply and hurriedly as possible. So as we think about the gold rush and the romanticized historical narratives that have often been associated with it, it's important to remember that the gold rush was an international event that dramatically transformed California and quickly established a new economy, culture, and social structure. Individual opportunities for wealth quickly diminished in light of the corporate enterprises. Race structured one's opportunities. Moreover, the immigration of the Chinese to California laid the groundwork for the nation's increasingly exclusionary immigration policies. And finally, the American conquest of California marked the decline of Native Americans in the region. That is all for now, but please stay tuned for the next video lecture.